let's move to vote. Any objecting to the budget as proposed? Any objecting to the budget as proposed? I can't, I'm hearing so much echo, I can't tell who's speaking. Marilyn? So much echo, I can't tell who's speaking. Marilyn?
I'm muting everybody right now. I'm muting everybody. I'm muting right now.
It's because, it might be because Cynthia is on there twice. That might be why. It might be because Cynthia is on there twice. That might be why.
Okay, everybody's muted right now. And
Karen is talking and she's muted.
everybody is muted right now except me.
Karen is talking and she's muted.
Everybody's muted right now except me. All right, Jenna, can you?
Yes?
Jenna.
I need to be able to speak.
No, you can't. Nobody can speak right now. No, we have to stop. Stop.
It sounds like they're having some technical difficulties in the Zoom meeting that they're having right now. But as soon as that is finished, then the presentation will get started here. So I'm just going to wait for them to adjourn the meeting.
How long do we need to stay stopped for, Marilyn? How long do we need to stay stopped for, Marilyn?
Okay.
How long do we need to stay stopped for, Marilyn? Not raise your hands if you vote affirmatively. For the budget. Is passed. Is passed. Going. Is passed. Going.
This is probably Nathan. This is probably Nathan. And he wants us to get his presentation started.
We can't start the presentation until we have at least one committee report from Judy. We have at least one committee report from Judy.
All right, the membership report, there are 98 members. We have one new member since March, and that's, oh no, that's my phone. We have William Bars. Sorry.
That actually was not the report I wanted her to give.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
Judy,
Yes.
Judy, can you give the report about the teacher roundtable meeting? Because that's coming up soon.
Yes, ma'am. Our next scheduled teacher roundtable gathering is planned for Friday, May 29th, 10 a.m. to 12 noon on Zoom. And Laura Chu Stokes of Easy Notes Piano will present some of her teaching tools, which have been helping teachers and students nationwide and internationally since 1989. And on Zoom, Laura will do a brief presentation. Then we'll have an opportunity to share ideas about what's going well with online lessons and what's not working. And I think Laura's going to send out a questionnaire just to find out what teachers would most need or have questions about in their transition online.
That's great. That's great. And then one more quick report that can, two actually. And Parker, can you unmute yourself? Is there any news from the Student Assistance Committee that you need to give us?
Not really. I just hope more applications come in. We only have about 6 so far, but I think you said you had some that needed to come in, didn't you, Karen? You said you had some needed to come in, didn't you, Karen?
Oh, yes, 4 more students. And now one last word from Wayne Smith, and unmute yourself, Wayne, for about the concert.
Yes, we have a date set for October 4th at First Presbyterian Church, downtown Asheville. They have a newly restored Baldwin grand piano. It's a beautiful concert space. The big question is, because of the pandemic, can we be live by then or virtual? But the good news is we plan to have a concert either way. If it's live, Shane ONB with Piano Emporium has agreed to let us have a second piano as he's done in the past. If it's virtual, Dan Engerstein has volunteered the use of his home with 2 wonderful grand pianos and fine acoustics. If it's going to be virtual, one option, and probably the best option, is to be pre-recorded and then to be viewed on a YouTube channel. When I understand the Piano Forum has their own dedicated channel. Another option is to be live streamed, but that might be more complicated. Nathan Shirley has volunteered his expertise to help us know how to record this and possibly do it himself for us. Since the spring concert was canceled, we will give those performers first chance to play this fall. The list of those interested in playing is growing. If anyone
Wayne,
would perform, now's the time to say so.
I wonder if we can, for all of the committee chairs, if there are, thank you. If for all of our committee chairs, if you have more information and reports, can you please post those reports to the members group? That way we don't have to cut Nathan short on his presentation. Is there any more business that anyone feels has to be stated right now or can't wait for another occasion?
I would
Frank,
like to know if this meeting has been recorded,
yes.
and I'd appreciate a recording, please, since
Yes, I sent you a chat.
I did not
Read the
get
chat.
that. Thank you.
And Virginia is taking minutes as well. All right, do I have a motion to adjourn the business portion of the meeting?
Before we adjourn, I don't know if it's going to be like this during the presentation. There's no point. I don't know what, Nathan doesn't know what's causing it either.
Something
never
we
had this
could
happen
do,
before.
we could all log back out and come back in. That is a possibility that could help it. That's happened in
That's
the
what I'm
past for
thinking.
me.
Jenna suggested everybody log out
Leave meeting, right?
and then log back in.
First, we need to adjourn the meeting.
Okay,
Okay.
I move that we adjourn.
Polly seconds it. We're all adjourned. Leave and come right back or go on our YouTube link that Nathan sent out last night.
Okay, it sounds like they are finished up there, so I'm going to go ahead and get ready to start this presentation now. Let me make sure that I've got their Zoom meeting muted so that it doesn't come through here. And then I'll be ready to go. Okay. That should take care of that. All right. It was good to see those of you that I was able to see in the Zoom meeting. I'd like to thank the Piano Forum for hosting this and inviting me to give this online presentation about my new piano method series here. And if you're watching this, feel free to drop any questions you might have along the way into the chat. And I'll get to those at the end or towards the end of the presentation here. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a classical composer and pianist, and I have been teaching for, somebody's calling me, let me just make sure that's, okay, so I've been teaching for over 20 years, and in addition to teaching piano, I've also taught composition, and I've done some classroom teaching as well in the public school systems. So Piano Revealed is a 7-book series, and it's designed for both reading age children and adults alike. And it's been in the works for about 20 years, so basically since I started teaching lessons, I've been writing these pieces. There's a lot of methods out there, a lot of interesting piano methods out there, and so the question might be, why a new one? And I'd like to talk a little bit about my experience teaching and going through a lot of different methods and what sort of led me down this path. So when I was first teaching, I found that there were quite a few gaps in the methods that I was using, that sometimes it might be that there was a specific student that needed extra work in a certain area. Sometimes there might not be a lot of great musical pieces for a specific level that a student was working on. And sometimes the particular method I was using just didn't really cover the technique that I felt was needed to further the student. So in the process, I ended up writing a lot of music, a lot of these pieces. And when I was living in Charlotte and teaching piano full-time, I lived not too far from Brat Music, which was basically the big sheet music hub in the Southeast, which was really nice because I could go over and go through the piano music there and all of the methods, and they had just about every method you could imagine. And I went through all of them at the time. And I was kind of disappointed in most of them for one reason or another. In particular, the music. Some of the methodology was quite good, and the quality of the music didn't always match up with the methodology quality from what I found. But a favorite method of mine was one that I eventually stumbled upon, The Joy of First Year Piano. And this is by the Hungarian Dinesh Agay, who some piano teachers might know because of his collection of, he put together all kinds of collections of music, like the early classics to moderns, which a lot of piano students work their way through. But he also wrote this piano method, just a single book, and a lot of people don't know about it. I think the reason is there's some kind of flaws to it that are not really easy for a lot of modern piano teachers to get around. For example, it uses the middle C approach, where both thumbs are sort of forced onto middle C, And for young students, it can kind of work, but for adults or older beginners, it can be kind of tricky, if not impossible. And so a lot of teachers just avoid that method entirely. But there is a benefit to that method, which is that there's a logic to the music reading side of the approach, which makes it very easy to get students reading quickly and branching out from middle C in two directions. So that method did inspire me quite a bit. It also contained quite a bit of good music. It wasn't completely consistent, in my opinion, but it did have some good, engaging music to it. It also moves really fast, which is problematic for a lot of students. And when I was using it, I was writing a lot of pieces that I would supplement, but I was supplementing all sorts of different things to kind of pad the music out to get the students to get through without hitting a major roadblock along the way. And besides that, though, it is a pretty solid method. And I'll come back to that a little bit, but let me jump to a few other things that I've found with some of the popular methods today. There's sort of one trend that I've noticed. A lot of methods employ what I call silly music, where they try to make the music really fun and engaging for the students, which might seem fantastic, because that's the whole idea, right, is to get children interested in music, and making it kind of fun and silly is sort of the obvious way to approach that. But I think there's a drawback to that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, which is that really it sort of assumes that children can't appreciate music with more depth, and it doesn't really give them enough credit. There's a lot of pieces of music out there that children have a huge ability to appreciate, like Peter and the Wolf, Carnival of the Animals, even though it wasn't written for children, Benjamin Britten's Guide to the Orchestra, and of course there's Disney's Fantasia and all of that. Not to mention that if students have a little bit of exposure to other music, they really can comprehend music with more subtlety and depth. And that's really where my method, sort of the germ of the concept of writing my own method and assembling these pieces together into a series came from. Without going too much deeper into other methods, let me just skip around a little bit. There's one thing that a lot of methods do, that they might have pretty solid music, but harmonically, they're sort of cheating, especially in the beginning levels. They're sort of cheating the harmonies in a way, especially the bass lines, in order to accommodate wherever the left hand in particular happens to be at the time. And so what happens is the music sounds a little half-baked and sort of forced in some ways. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's when you're writing a melody and an accompaniment, it's easy to find yourself restricted to the point where you're not sure where to take the left hand, since you can't necessarily just jump down to that low bass note that you would normally use, since the student might not be ready for that. And so these compromises come up a lot in music that really does have good intentions. And it's not all like this. Of course, there's plenty of really good music out there too, but it does seem to be a common trend. One way that some methods get around this is to include teacher duets, which are fantastic. So the teacher can play along with the student, and the student gets to hear a much more filled out, harmonically complete, with the proper bass, that the music deserves. But the one problem with that is when they go home to practice, they're practicing without any of that. So they are left with this kind of compromised musical line a lot of times. And I don't want to beat up too much on different methods because there is a lot of really valuable material out there. But I think as a composer, from my perspective, trying to teach, these are things that really kind of grated on me, especially when you're teaching the same music over and over again. And again, what kind of led me down this path. There's a lot of music written for children by Tchaikovsky, Schumann, Prokofiev, Stravinsky, and a lot of really great composers, but most of them didn't write all that much music for students, and also they didn't tend to write extremely simple music. So teaching a lot of these pieces, though, I more and more got inspired to try and do my own, sort of in that same vein, and trying to keep the quality high while maintaining music that students would be capable of playing and that they would get some educational guidance from. Let me go ahead and jump into the beginning of what I've prepared here. And let me just make sure. I'm going to switch over here. Okay, so before I show you some of the material inside of these books, I wanted to just say that in addition to this sort of different approach with trying to write very engaging but high quality music, I also covered a lot of sort of unique aspects that some methods cover to an extent, but most of them don't cover it to that large of a degree, if at all. So some of the music, there's a huge range of tonalities. It's not just major and a little bit of minor. There's every mode, at least two pieces of Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Locrian. And there's quite a few different pentatonic scales that are presented throughout the series, from China, from Japan, from Indonesia. There's Persian scales, Roma scales. I even wrote a piece with Scriabin's Mystic Chord, which is turned into a scale to form the basis of a piece. There's a piece with an octatonic scale, whole tone, chromatic. There's even a 4-tone tetratonic scale, and then quite a few others. And I also teach improvisation and composition from the very beginning. Back in the Baroque and the classical periods, this would have been the norm, and most people played musical instruments. But in addition to that, most of them actually improvised and even composed a little bit at least. And over the years, that started to fall out of fashion, or at least people stopped being taught how to do it. It's hard to know exactly what the causes of that were, but by the Romantic period, fewer people were composing themselves as amateur musicians, but most were still improvising quite a bit. By the time you get to the 20th century, it falls off very sharply, and this is about the time when music conservatories were sprouting up all over the place, and the sort of institutionalized teaching of music was becoming more the norm. And also recordings were coming out and spreading all over the place. So again, it's hard to know exactly what happened, but people very quickly stopped improvising, at least in the classical music world. And they stopped composing. and the number of really great classical composers started to dwindle. Meanwhile, jazz came on the scene, and people were, of course, improvising in jazz constantly. So it's kind of fascinating to think about what might have happened with classical music. But anyway, my method seeks to get back to this creativity within the music education system from the beginning. And there's no reason why people should shy away from it, except a lot of teachers haven't been taught themselves. So my method tries to introduce it in a very simple, basic way at the beginning, and then build bit by bit. It doesn't go into great depth on composition and improvisation, but enough to give a good taste for it to experiment and develop further on the student's own time. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the material here. In the towards the beginning of the first book, I present a timeline which shows basically the history of the piano and of written music. And you can see the music notes going across here with different years of the first known written music, and 3,400 years ago and on through. And this is actually to scale as far as the timeline is concerned. And then the first playable written music, as far as historians have been able to determine, and the invention of the harpsichord and clavichord and so on. Here's a detail of some of that. And I've got a lot in here, so I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. One thing that I do right at the beginning is I present two different methods for counting rhythms. The first of which is using syllables, and the second of which is using the normal counting by number system that is used all over the world. But my experience in teaching in the classroom in public schools was that, especially for younger kids, teaching by syllables sped up the process of them learning to read rhythm by a huge amount. And I developed my own system for using syllables rather than the T's and Ta's and different systems like that, which are primarily starting with teaching quarter notes and eighth notes. My system teaches whole notes, half notes, and quarter notes first, in using syllables from words that are common and that all kids would know immediately. So it speeds up the process just that much more. Plus it gives three different varieties of notes at once. So you've got the very slowly, 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 fast, 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 for the quarter, half, and whole notes. And then there's a few different exercises that the students can go through in the process here. And then we get introduced to the number counting system. And the concept here is for teachers that want to use one system or the other, they can simply choose which one they want to teach. They could teach both if they want. And in fact, I kind of recommend that for most students, at least, they be introduced to the syllable system, and then they can go back and learn the counting by number system, particularly when they get to eighth notes and they're doing subdivisions and things like that, and multiple rhythms at once, where the number system really comes in handy. So for older students or for adults, the number system could be easily taught from the very beginning. And so we get the traditional system of counting by 1, 2, 3, 4 and 4, 4 time, showing how whole notes, let's see, half notes, oh, that's on a different page, but how the half notes are being held for 2 beats, and the, oh, here it is, a half note can start on beat 1 or beat 3 or beat 2 for that matter. And then we get this juxtaposition of the 2 systems, the syllables and numbers, for when a student is trying to transition from the syllables to the numbers. And this is sort of the introduction to pitch. And this is jumping around a huge amount. There's quite a lot of material in the beginning, so I've just picked some random things to highlight, particularly aspects that would be pretty unique to Piano Revealed. So here we see the entire 88 key keyboard from low to high, and we've got a few instruments laid out that are generally in the range that they would play, like the contrabassoon right down towards the bottom of the piano, the piccolo right up towards the top, and violin and trombone here. So let's continue. Now the way that I present pitch in this this book is the rhythm is taught first through clapping and that sort of thing, and then almost immediately after, pitch is introduced, but only with 3 different notes at once. So my idea for this kind of was inspired by percussion music and some percussion methods, but where you would have a single staff line for, say, a snare drum, and then if you wanted to do a rim shot or something else, instead of the note being right on the line, you could place it above or below for different effects that you're doing, or different drums for that matter. But this high, medium, and low is a very simple way to introduce students to just the fundamentals of reading pitch. And so in this example, we've got notes that are above the line, notes that are pierced by the line, and then notes that are under the line. And this can be done away from the piano, clapping their hands for the high notes, patting their legs for the middle, and tapping your feet for the low notes. And then a little music exercise there. And then you can see right down here, there's a little composition assignment, so they can, after they've played through this and they've got an idea for how it works, they can just draw a line on a sheet of paper, write some notes in, quarter, half, whole, however they want, and then try to play it. So that's a very easy way to introduce the concept of composition, even as simple as that. So the section on posture here is a little more in depth than a lot of piano methods, and I think posture is incredibly important, and a lot of teachers are becoming more and more aware of that importance. So I go into a bit more detail. For the younger student, they can simply look at the right side of this to get reminded of what they need to remember. And for older students, they can easily read in depth about the specifics outlined there. And here's an example of a very simple improvisation lesson where the details of what is suggested are over on the right side here. Just making sure you can see that. And the teacher can go through this with the student during the lesson. And then the picture here should be straightforward enough that even a young child would see that and remember what they had done in the lesson and know to put this finger on that note and these fingers on these notes. And let's keep going here. So here's another example using A, B, and C on the white keys, with A as sort of the tonal center, and then improvising on all 5 black keys and moving from one position to another. So this is all before reading standard piano music has been introduced, to really get a feel for the keyboard and how it's laid out. All right, so at this point, now we're starting to introduce standard staff. And the way that I've done this is with a five-pronged fork here, which is stabbing at these P's that happen to be whole notes. And if we zoom in on this, students can get a very quick idea that notes can either be wedged between the prongs on a space, or they can be pierced by a line. Young students sometimes have trouble with differentiating that and understanding the importance of that difference. And so here I've started to introduce ledger lines already, higher notes, lower notes, even lower, even higher, since middle C is going to be kind of key in this initial part of music reading. And over here we get the treble clef, and how you can see either an uppercase or lowercase g in the treble clef, which helps you remember that the line that cuts through the circular part of the G is where G would go. And the same thing for the F of the bass clef, slowly evolving into the symbol that it is today for the bass F. And then we see the relationship between the treble G, the bass F, and middle C, which is now introduced. Equal distance, a fifth apart, going outwards. And then we get that translated to the piano keys. So this part wouldn't be too different from a lot of methods. And another view where middle C is exactly centered between the treble and the bass, so that students can quickly see the relationship of C to D and C down to B in the bass, and how they correspond to the keyboard. And then, just to be thorough, to explain how regular music is written, that there's a bigger gap between the two staves, and C can be written, the same middle C can be written in two ways, whether it belongs to the treble or whether it belongs to the bass. And not just C is unique with that, obviously D and B as well. And some of this material could be jumped over or sped through for younger children, and then older students could go into it with more detail. So then we come to the first piece that is notated in standard notation, and this jumps right into the grand staff. So there's no floating notes with a letter superimposed over the note head. And I think this approach works well for even younger children. I typically wouldn't recommend starting pre-literate children with this sort of thing, because I think cognitively they do need to be at a point where they're able to comprehend reading words fairly fluently in order to cognitively understand how reading notes works. I think the two are very similar in the what's needed there to understand all of that. So this is pretty straightforward. We just have the right hand image of where the hand is going to be for the notes in the left hand, and the two hands take turns playing. So this does use a middle C approach, even though I just spent some time talking about the pitfalls of the middle C approach. But the way that I get around this in the method is the two thumbs never need to actually share C, so the hands are taking turns. And it's not too long before the hands start separating beyond middle C. So one hand will be on middle C, another will be a little higher, and vice versa. And they start moving outwards much quicker. So these steps are laid out as far as first figuring out what the note is, next figuring out where it is on the piano, and then third figuring out what finger plays it. And that's sort of repeated here so that students get an idea that this series of steps is very useful for playing any piece. And there's a close-up of each hand. And then just another piece in the same vein here, so 2 notes. And it's also recommended that students try these first little pieces with different fingers, so they can start with just the second finger, then just the third finger, and shifting their hand to get a feel for using different groups of two fingers in different positions. And then branches out to 3 notes, still moving away from the middle C center. And it's not too long, I'm jumping all over the place here, but it's not too long before some new Cs are introduced, so an octave above and below the middle C, and then this shows how it corresponds to the full keyboard here. And then this is an image detailing that again with standard notation, where you've got this gap between the treble clef middle C and the bass clef middle C. And then what I've done is reversed the treble and bass over here, so that when the student flips the book upside down, you get the exact same thing with this mirror image of the C's. And once they start understanding that concept, they'll be able to find these notes much more quickly. So it's similar to some of the methods that use guide notes or landmark notes in that respect. I'm kind of mixing a few different reading methods in some of this. And then it's not too long before the students are playing in these new higher areas based around the C's that they now know. And then this shows that how when you have 2 notes vertically aligned, the stems are not what align, but the center of the note head. And I've seen so many students that struggle with getting that concept. So this makes it quite a bit more clear when they can actually see it with an arrow connecting the centers of the note heads. And then just a little graphic for legato. There are some graphics along the way in this book, but it's kind of minimal, and when they are there, it's usually to illustrate something that would be almost impossible to put into words otherwise. So in general, it's a pretty clutterless, clean look overall. And so here we've got this introduction into 2-note slurs, where I wanted to say something else. I won't go back to it, but the third piece in this, where you have 3 notes, is in a minor key. So even from the very beginning, it doesn't shy away from different tonalities. And this one is another example where you're in basically natural minor or Aeolian mode. And I'll play this little bit for you. Let me just get my keyboard ready down here. Okay, so this should go through. So this is just a little original folk song, and the hands are no longer both around middle C. The right hand is shifted up a bit. All right. And I wanted to play that one because I'll come back to it in a bit, or a related piece. So here we've got, let me make sure my audio is still good. Here we've got two rests, the half rest and the whole rest, and just a graphic for representing the whole. And now we eventually come to, and there's quite a few pieces in the meantime, but now we come to an even higher C and an even lower C, again, mirror imaged and shown here with the keyboard. And again, we see the way that the notes are mirror imaged here. Seem to be getting a lot of calls, so hopefully people aren't having trouble watching this. It is being recorded, so it should be available. So again, same mirror image concept, and you flip the book over and you see that it's identical. And then immediately the student is reading these notes in practice. And this particular piece is the same one from the very beginning. Instead of just a melody alone, now it's got this accompaniment with the C's in different octaves. And that's a common tool that I use in this series, is introducing a piece that then builds later on, or there's variations. Sometimes I would write a piece and then simplify it, break it down into sort of component elements and rewrite them to make them different, but in a way that would prepare the student for the more complex pieces. And other times I would do the opposite. So here's another one that I'll play, Cathedral, and this is just an example of how I think even with very simple music, if you're careful, you can do a good harmonic job. So let me play this little example real quick. All right, and let's get back here. Then we get back to our folk dance again, but this time it's has an extended section. The beginning section is varied a little bit more, and the student will be familiar with it. So even though it's a good bit more challenging, they'll have a head start with it. So now the folk song has become a folk dance. And let's see. All right. And let me get back here. I'm going to change one setting here before we continue. Okay. And so continuing on this next page, and I'm going to get rid of my picture here so you can see this a little bit better. This might look a little bit strange, but what we've got here is a system that I like to use for teaching crescendos and decrescendos, and also accelerandos and ritardandos. And students can draw these lines themselves and try to play them. But basically, what I have them do is start with just a repeated note, one in each hand, playing over and over, starting slowly and quietly, and building up in speed and volume, and then coming back down. And the slope determines how fast or how slow they build up and how fast they come back down. So the opposite here, they would have to do a very quick crescendo and accelerando and then gradually build back down. The first one comes the most natural, a slow build up and then a quick decline. This one is generally a little bit more tricky for students, particularly the decrescendo. It's a kind of fascinating thing, but I've seen it's pretty consistently harder to do a good decrescendo than a crescendo for young students. And the same with accelerando versus ritardando. And then this one being very even. And then this example here where it goes all over the place, and you could imagine the dynamic being very quiet at the bottom and very loud, building up to a climax at the end. And then, like I said, students can draw these lines on their own and just look at them and play through and try to do it as smoothly and gradually as they can. And then they can try to reverse these two, play a crescendo with a ritardando and vice versa, things like that to mix it up. And then the other thing that I like to have students do is try to use this as an improvisation tool too. So if they make up a little pattern that repeats, even if it's just 2 or 3 notes, and they can use that pattern to go through these various curves. All right. And then we get the introduction of the sustain pedal, which pretty standard here. But this is a system that I came up with, and we'll come back to the pedaling, but this system I came up with in order to teach playing legato with one hand and staccato with the other. This is a bit further into along in the music. And if you slow it down to an extreme, to the point where your staccato note is basically just a regular quarter note and your legato note is a whole note, then students can quickly get the concept of pressing both together, taking their time to release the first one, holding the one for 4 beats, and then again going for the second one. And as they get comfortable with this, they can speed it up more and more and more until they get to the point where it's more like a staccato in one hand and a smooth legato in the other, at which point they can move into this. Another kind of unique thing that I've done is, so this is demonstrating a slightly more advanced repeat, the DC al fine, where it goes back to the beginning and ends at the fine. And then slightly more complicated with the dies al coda, where it goes to the dies al coda, goes back to the sine, to the coda symbol, which takes them to the coda to the end. And in order to, especially for younger students, to really get the concept of these different repeats, especially the most complicated one, I wrote a piece specifically dealing with this DSL coda repeat, and I wrote a story to go along with it, which, as you'll hear as it goes through, the events in the story line up with the different repeat symbols. So let's have a listen to Journey Home. And again, this is very simple piano music, so this is a little bit further along in the first book, but it's not terribly far into it. Journey Home. It was night, and Little Hedgehog was on her way home. She didn't hurry, but kept a steady pace so she would get home before sunrise. Up and down over the hills she went. She paused to take 2 deep breaths before continuing over yet more hills once again. This time, her steps were lighter, as she needed to save her strength. As Little Hedgehog paused again, she spotted the sign for the Dalsigno Forest and knew just which way to go. The path was gentle once again. There in a tree up ahead was the mark for her neighborhood, Coda Burrows. She knew her journey was nearing its end. Just as the sky was beginning to lighten, she slowed her pace. There it was off in the distance, her cozy burrow under the great oak tree. Once inside, Little Hedgehog closed the door and settled in for a well-deserved nap. Okay, so hopefully that gives an idea of how that piece works. I'm going to see if I can continue on here. All right. So next we get to the sustain pedal, which I was mentioning before. And the way that I introduce the sustain pedal is kind of similar to my approach with the staccato and legato into hands at once. And what I've done here is the right hand is playing with only the middle finger for all of these various notes. So it forces the student to have a gap of silence between each note. So there's no possible way to play legato except by using the pedal. And so everything is slowed down to an extreme, and they are counting, and let's see, I think I've got a close-up here. Yeah. So as they're counting, they are repedaling, changing the pedal on beat 2, which normally would be quite a bit later than you would normally want to repedal, but it's an exaggeration to teach the concept. So they press the note on beat 1, they repedal on beat 2, they release their finger on beat 3, but continue to hold the pedal through 3 and 4, and 1 of the next, and then repedal on 2, and so on and so forth all the way through. And if it's introduced very slowly, they, in my experience, they usually get the hang of it really pretty quickly. And then again, you can speed it up bit by bit until they're repedaling about at a more reasonable rate, at which point they could go through this exercise. Again, only third finger to force a gap in between, but now with the pedal making it legato. Now this is a bit further on, but at this point there's an introduction of one hand playing louder than the other. So this would be for balancing dynamics between a melody and an accompaniment, or anything like that. So we've got the left hand beginning at forte, and then we've got the right hand written with these X note heads, these ghosted notes, where the student is just tapping the key without actually letting it go down. And I forgot to bring up my image here, which might be helpful for this one. So instead of pressing the key all the way down, they're just tapping the key. And I found that if they do this slowly, they can get a feel for balancing the two hands independently, but at the same time. So once they get to the point where, let's go over here. Oops. Once they get to the point where they're doing both hands at the same time, they can more easily feel this exaggerated difference between just silently playing one hand and actually playing one with a good bit of force, until they get to the point where they're pressing the key down and playing quietly with one and loud with the other one. And there's notes about trying it to different degrees in between. And again, starting slow, building up speed. And then once they've done that staccato, then they would go back and do everything legato with the same ghosting of one hand and playing loud with the other. And then they get a piece where they get to actually try this with some music. So this repeated left hand note would easily overpower a melody on top, unless they play it very quietly and bring out the melody simultaneously. And this is a piece which introduces the concept of counting through the 7 musical notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, backwards, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. So you can see that the actual notes in the piece are exactly what the title says, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. And that forms sort of an ostinato that's repeated, and then a very simple melody that comes in that's sort of woven above and below. And that piece comes back quite a few times until it's quite a bit more complex eventually. So this is a little prelude, another example of a piece that recurs. When it starts, it's just a very simple left hand, single dotted half note, and then 2 right hand notes that repeat, and they go through different sort of harmonic areas and then return. And what I did was because it's so simple and it also works pretty well for the left hand alone, I wrote it out for the left hand alone, which would come later, and the student would remember the piece, understand the mechanics of it, and then have to figure out how to do it with the left hand alone. And then even later in the series, it comes back again where there's a melody put in the right hand on top of this left hand. So here is the left hand version, which is the same as the original, just left hand alone. And then you'll hear the version for 2 hands with a new part added. And I think I just skipped that. Let's see. Okay, and moving on here. So now we've got not only, and this is quite a bit further along here, but again, jumping around a lot just to show some unique things here. Now we've got not only staccato in one hand and legato in the other, but also balancing dynamics at the same time, and then switching, reversing. And then this is way further along, but it does introduce different types of grace notes. And without going into the details of different practices of different grace notes throughout time and by different composers and what the intention of this particular grace note was, it's more based on modern standards, even though it's still not standard today. But the series does explain that to an extent. And this, let me make sure you can see that. Oh, yeah. And so this line just simply shows that this particular grace note is before the beat. And then this one is with the beat. And I wanted to show an example of some music that is a little bit more modern tonal wise, and it shifts. It's not always quite in the same tonality. So here is an example, the Phantom. Okay, so moving on, now we've got, this is an example again of something more advanced where we've got double dotted notes, and the way that those work, you can imagine the multiple ties adding up to double dotted notes. And even though double dotted notes are pretty rare in most music, the reason why I decided to introduce this is because it, by understanding how double dots work, it reinforces how single dots work and kind of drives home that concept. And then the series also goes through quite a few different pieces with somewhat more unusual time signatures. So here we have a piece that actually is constantly changing time signatures from 6/4 to 5/4 to 4/4 to 3/4 to 2/4 to 6/4 again to 5/4 to 4/4, 3/4, 2/4, and then 1/4, and then at that point the time has run out. Here's a piece in 5/4. And see how we're doing time-wise here. I'll play one more piece here and then check and see if I have any questions. And this is an example of a more kind of modal piece. Okay, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and make sure I didn't have anything else within the book itself. Okay, let me get through here. Oh yeah, well there was one other thing that I wanted to mention, which was that the book actually introduces the sostenuto pedal as well. And so what's happening here is you've got a very simple piece that uses the sostenuto pedal in about the easiest way imaginable, where you're basically just holding it for a really long time. So you're sustaining the first chord and then everything else is staccato around it, but this C major kind of continues on as the music progresses. So it's kind of an unusual piece, but for students that have grand pianos, they could practice this at home, or they could easily practice this on their own, and then when they had access to a grand piano, they could give it a try and get a feel for how the sostenuto does work. And the soft pedal, or the unicorda pedal, is introduced as well. And this piece is a little bit more complex, but it employs the sostenuto pedal and the unicorda pedal back and forth. And then there's even a little bit of, once they've got it down, they can try to use the sustain pedal while the sostenuto is down for a more advanced technique with the pedal system. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take a look and see if I have any questions here. And I see that I think some people were trying to watch through Zoom, and maybe that wasn't working too well. So let me first pull up my YouTube page here and see if we've got any questions. I'm gonna all right, and just bear with me for a minute while I find this. Okay. All right, lots of comments here. Thanks everybody for bearing with me. This is my first official live stream, and I had about a million technical things that I was trying to do in the meantime, so a little tricky here. So I've got some interesting comments. Students enjoy repetition, beginning with something they already know and gently sliding into new learning. Yeah, and I've definitely found that myself teaching, and that coming back to a familiar piece, especially when it has a few new things going on in it, can be really interesting for children and adults alike, and give them that boost that they might not have had if they suddenly went into this complex piece less prepared for it. So let's see. Thanks, Judy, for that comment. And okay, how do we access your method? Okay, so I did want to talk about this a little bit. With the virus going around and everything sort of going up in the air, the production of the book has been delayed a little bit, but I'm happy to report that it's very close to production at this point. In fact, I just got the proofs, just received the proofs for the covers here. So we've got the, this is, let's see if I can show it so you can actually see it. This is the book 1, and hopefully you can get an idea of the reverse here. And then all the way through to book 7. So my, at this point, it's looking like the books will go into production fairly soon, probably within the coming week. And then at that point, they'll probably be ready to ship within I'd say 2 to 3 weeks, within that range. And so if you're interested in the series and taking a look at ordering some books, there'll also be an ebook version too, which will come out about the same time. But you can go to pianorevealed.com. You can also find it through my website, nathanshirley.com. But there's a pre-order form there, and it's got shipping information and that sort of thing. So let me see, I've got another question here. How many pages in the book? Yeah, okay, good question. So the first book is quite a bit bigger than the other books. The first book, because it has so much introductory material, it ends up being around 80-ish pages, and then all of the other books are more around the 50-ish mark. And let's see, when and where is it available? So I covered that. And then let's see. Oh yeah, so as far as the difficulty, is it beginner, intermediate, or advanced? So book 1 starts from absolute beginner, so early elementary. And by the time you got all the way through book 7, you would be in a pretty solid intermediate level. There, in the very last book, book 7, there are a decent number of pieces that kind of touch on the late intermediate. So it sort of gets your feet wet for that, but it's basically in the solid intermediate level. Quite a few tricky things towards the end, but and since there's 7 books, it doesn't exactly go along with the first book is early beginner, the second is beginner or elementary, depending on your terminology, and late elementary, and then into early intermediate, late intermediate. It's not quite that neat. It goes a little bit slower, so it's a little bit more progressive than 1 level per book. Also, another thing that I should have mentioned that's kind of unique about it is I did some research into the optimal size of notation, so the font size for the music. I was interested in if there were any studies done with reading language in different font size, because you see these early reader books where the font is gigantic. And from the studies that I read, they did find that larger font tended to benefit not just children, but even adults, which I found kind of interesting. But the extent that it benefits once you get over a certain size starts falling off pretty rapidly. And younger children benefited a little bit more. So I do start with a pretty large font, but then to make it sort of a seamless process of reading through and going through the books, I have it so the font shrinks imperceptibly along the way. So by the time you're, I think, somewhere into the third book, it's gotten to roughly a standard music font size. But you'll never see the difference one piece to the next. And once it does get up to the standard size, it's kind of a generous standard size, but it is within a typical range there. Yeah, so thanks for the questions, Jenna. Let me see if there's any other questions that I missed here. The prelude is beautiful, thanks. Mirror image, yeah. Thanks, Polly. Got a lot of nice comments here. I appreciate everybody. Yeah, so let me just make sure I haven't forgotten anything that I wanted to cover. Oh, one interesting note that I thought some people might like to know. If you're wondering where I came up with this concept of the rainbow strings on the piano for the cover. And by the way, a shout out to my brother, Aaron Shirley, who came up with this design for the piano and did the art for it. And also the photo on the back. But my concept for this came from Isaac Newton, actually. So Isaac Newton was the one who is credited as first naming or distinguishing the different colors of the rainbow and sort of explaining it. And initially when he, you can remember the Roy G. Biv for the 7 colors, but when he initially came up with the 7 rainbow, or described the initial colors, he only named 6. And he eventually later, he sort of practiced this mystical Christianity, and he had all these concepts of sort of divine numbers, and he thought that since there were 7 days in the week and 7 planets at the time, and all these different things coming in sevens, he thought that rainbows must be 7 also, because music had 7 notes in the scale, of course in the diatonic Western scale. But I found that pretty fascinating, and so he went back and he thought, well, really you could kind of say there's this indigo also, this dark blue in there. So that's a little nod to Isaac Newton, where you've got the 7 strings. And if you look carefully at the keys here, they're actually notes. It's a little out of focus there. Anyway, let me see if there was anything else. I'd really like to thank the Piano Forum for being willing to give this a shot, trying to do a presentation online, live streamed. And so thanks for everybody who made it happen, Karen and Marilyn. Greatly appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank all of the people who backed the project on Kickstarter, who helped fund it and make it possible to go into production, which is almost in the works at this point. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. And let me just make sure there's no other questions here before I end this. We actually have a couple more minutes if anybody does have another question. Thanks, Les. I appreciate it. There's one other thing that I didn't say that I considered talking about, which was Bartok's Microcosmos, which was another inspiration for this project. And can you show us a little of the higher level books? I didn't pull out material from. Well, I did some, like when you get to the different types of grace notes and things, that comes from some of the higher level books. But I didn't prepare that in the slides, so I can't easily pull all of that up right now. But it does get to a good solid intermediate, kind of late intermediate, a little bit here and there. Another question. Let's see. Just a page or two. Yeah, if I had a way to easily pull it up, I definitely would. I'm trying to think. Oh, okay. So here's a way you can look at it. There is a piece. In fact, I've got it. I might be able to play it for you. I'll end with it. How about that? There's a piece that comes from one of the last books. I believe it's the last book. That I can play as an example. But I've got some more questions here real quick. So, will this live stream be available as a podcast? So, I haven't thought about that yet, but it will be available on YouTube afterwards. So if anybody missed the beginning of it or wants to rewatch any of it, you should be able to do that as soon as this ends. And let's see, I've got another question coming in. Thanks, Philip, for that question. So I understand the first books have some introductory notes, text for the students. Does that go all the way through book 7, or do you at some point drop these? So there's less. The first book contains a lot of text because there's so many new concepts to go over. The further along that the student gets in the series, the less text there is, just because there's fewer new concepts, but there still is quite a bit. And some of it gets a little more advanced, and some of it goes into a little bit of history. So there's discussions on the way that rhythmic notes are named in different countries, and there's things like that. But throughout the book, there are sort of annotations and notes within the music that help explain new concepts and that sort of thing. So thanks for that question, Emil. Appreciate that. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Susan. Thanks. Yeah, she says, I'm sure students and parents will thank you for that, for the compositions. Are so beautiful. Thanks. Appreciate it. And then Marilyn's asking for people to go back to Zoom after I close this out, so I'll do that as well for questions there. Oh, yeah, and let me check speaking of which, let me check my Zoom feed for questions, which I have, unless it kicked me out. Wonder if I got timed out of Zoom at some point. Yeah, I'll check that and then and go onto that as soon as I end. So yeah, thanks. Let me end with one of those pieces that I mentioned to Jenna that I would play. This is a little bit more advanced, and let me see if I can find it to pull it up here. It's not the most advanced that it gets into, but it's a little challenging here. So let me pull up. I believe I can get to that through. Just bear with me here. Okay. Oh, so there's a fugue. Now let me make this so you can see it. This is not one of the more difficult ones, but just the fact that it's a fugue at all makes it a little more challenging. So this comes a bit later in the series. And here we've got a four-hand piano piece that's a little more challenging. This one is a little more challenging, but let me play this one, and I'll end it as soon as this is over. So I'll just now say thanks everybody for tuning in, and I appreciate the questions, and again thanks to everybody at the Piano Forum. This is Midwinter's Night.